You already know more than you think. Maybe you can't put it into words, but you can feel it. When someone smiles too much, when an answer sounds rehearsed, when the silence between sentences weighs more than what was actually said. Deep down, we feel it. We sense it. And sometimes, we even run from it. But not today. Today, we're going to face it. Nietzsche once said that people lie, first and foremost, to themselves, and that what we often call personality is just a defense, armor built from fear and silence. In this video, you won't hear ready-made phrases or shallow solutions. You'll find uncomfortable truths, yes, but also deep tools to help you see what no one ever taught you to notice. Every part of this video holds a key, a clue, a revealed wound, and if you skip something, you might miss exactly what would make everything finally make sense. This isn't just about others, it's about you too. The layers you hide, the patterns you repeat, the fears you cover up with control, laughter, or strength. Seeing through people changes everything, but it takes courage, because sometimes what we find is a reflection of ourselves. No one is born knowing who they are. We figure it out, or we shape ourselves from early on. We learn that being accepted comes with a price. Adapting. A softer tone here. A swallowed opinion there. Slowly, without realizing, we start putting on a mask. A social persona. It's not fake, it's protection. The way our body and mind learn to survive in a world that doesn't always welcome what's genuine. In that sense, the mask is like a coat on a cold night. It doesn't show who you really are underneath, but it keeps you alive. This armor isn't a conscious choice. Most people don't choose to stay quiet, smile on cue, or always be pleasant. They do it because they learned, sometimes the hard way, that being real can hurt, that showing too much can backfire. That's where the persona is born, as a silent agreement between the fear of rejection and the longing to belong. Nietzsche and Jung saw this as something inevitable. We adapt to society, but pay the price of internal disconnection, and that price often comes in disguise. A tiredness that won't go away, the feeling of always acting, the constant doubt. If I showed who I really am, would they still love me? Over time, the mask sticks, and we might even confuse ourselves with it. Forget where the character ends and the real person begins. It's no surprise so many people feel exhausted without knowing why. Living under a made-up identity is like running in tight shoes. You might reach the finish line, but it'll hurt the whole way. But masks slip. They always do. And when they do, something valuable happens. When the laughter breaks, when the gaze drifts off, when the voice trembles, small slips that say more than any rehearsed speech. It's in those cracks that the truth leaks out. Those who learn to spot these moments start to see others in a new light. More human, more raw, more real. And what if this is just the beginning? Realizing that everyone wears a mask is only the first step. What comes next is even more complex. Noticing that even laughter can hide pain. That sometimes, the person who keeps everyone laughing is the one running hardest from their own silence. So let's go into this together, because what's behind the laugh might be much deeper than it seems. Some people turn themselves into jokes before ever giving themselves a chance to be real. We've all seen, or been, that person who turns everything into humor, always with a witty comeback, always joking, as if laughter could hold everything together. But sometimes, what seems like lightness is just armor, a way to dodge painful questions, to hide wounds that never healed. Humor, when used as a disguise, becomes a secret code, a quiet way of saying there's pain here, without having to face that pain directly. Nietzsche once said that laughter was born of fear, and that idea hits hard when we stop to really think. Fear of judgment, of rejection, of being exposed. It all hides behind a loud laugh. You know that person who jokes about always being left out, about always being the last pick. We laugh along, but something feels off, like the body wants to scream. But all that comes out is a joke, and that joke isn't fake. It's too real. It's just telling half the truth. That kind of humor has perfect timing, perfect tone, Even a script. It's not spontaneous. It's a shield. The joke becomes a habit, and silence becomes a threat. Because in silence, all the emotions swept under the rug start to move, and no one wants to deal with that in front of others. So the only option is to keep the spotlight on. The joke's flowing all the time. It's exhausting, but the alternative feels even scarier. To be bare, unscripted, left with only what you truly feel. And here's the strange thing. The more someone jokes about their own pain, the less people realize it's a cry for help. Laughter misleads. It makes it seem like everything's fine, like the person's over it, strong, mature enough to laugh at themselves. But that's not always true. Sometimes, it's just the prettiest way pain found to stay alive, because if it showed up raw, maybe no one would stay. Maybe no one would know what to do with it. In the end, what that nervous laugh hides is the same as so many other camouflage behaviors. A huge fear of truly being seen. Because being seen takes courage. And courage isn't always available. But if we start paying attention to those moments when the laugh comes too quickly, to the stories told as jokes that hurt just to hear, maybe we'll learn to hear what's being said behind the sound. Because some laughs, deep down, are muffled screams. There are things we only hear when we learn to listen to what wasn't said. The silence between sentences. The glance that turns away mid-conversation. The lips pressed tight before changing the subject. It's in those little pauses that the truth many try to hide lives. Human communication was never just about words. Often, it happens in the gaps, and it's exactly in those spaces, when the sound fades but the weight remains, that the unconscious speaks the loudest. Freud once said, "Slips reveal more than speeches." And maybe he was right, because when words fail, the soul whispers. Think about the most meaningful conversations you've had, the ones that stirred something inside you. There's always that moment when the other person pauses, hesitates, or changes the subject, and you just feel it. Something hangs in the air, unspoken, like when someone avoids talking about their father and suddenly looks away, or when their voice shakes while mentioning childhood, only to be covered up with a laugh. The body gives away what the mind tries to hide. Silence isn't just an empty space. It's often a shortcut to what hasn't been processed yet. The problem is, most of us have learned to be uncomfortable with silence. We rush to fill every pause with small talk, nervous laughter, or hollow explanations. But what if, instead of running from silence, we started listening to it more closely? Maybe silence isn't absence. Maybe it's the fertile ground where truth begins to grow. Lacan once said that the unconscious is structured like a language, and every language has its blank spaces. Ignoring those is like reading a book and skipping the paragraphs. You lose the rhythm. You miss the meaning. In a world that's always shouting, those who can listen to the silence have an edge. Not because they're clever, but because they're sensitive, by paying attention to what's not being said. You tap into the rawest part of another person, the pain that never found words, the fear hiding behind a quick answer, the affection that never turned into a confession. That's where real emotional insight happens, and where the deepest connections are built. In those moments, silence reveals more than any confession ever could. So next time you're with someone, try listening beyond the words. Notice the pauses, the caught breath, the themes that come up often, and the ones that never do. The mind speaks quietly, but the body speaks loud. And silence is a scream. But only those who aren't afraid to hear what might hurt can truly listen. Because sometimes what's left unsaid says everything. There are people who go through life acting like they've got all the answers. They speak with such conviction, it almost feels theatrical. Like there's no room for doubt, no space for mistakes. But deep down, it's easy to sense that certainty often tastes like hidden desperation. The truth is, the more someone feels the need to prove they're right all the time, the more fragile they usually are inside. That unshakable confidence is often just armor, quickly thrown on to hide emotional chaos no one's allowed to see. Have you ever met a boss who never admits a mistake? Or someone who shuts down valid points with, "That's just how I am," period? That kind of rigid stance may look like strength, but it often comes from fear. Fear of appearing weak, fear of being questioned, fear of losing control. Kierkegaard said that despair sometimes hides behind certainty, and it makes sense. When everything inside feels like it's falling apart, the instinct is to seem firm, at least on the outside. This kind of behavior is more common than we think, because doubt is scary. Uncertainty demands courage, and it's way easier to cling to a rigid script than to face your own contradictions. But living in this I always know mode is like building a castle on sand. It might look solid, but the first strong tide will wash it away. Rigidity, in this case, isn't stability. It's defense. It's like the person is saying, if I stop to think too much, it all comes crashing down. And this facade comes at a cost. People who can't tolerate ambiguity tend to shut down dialogue, block personal growth, and isolate themselves emotionally, because someone who can't show doubt also can't ask for help, and that need to always be right becomes a prison. The more absolute someone's stance, the less room there is for others to exist. Anyone who questions them is seen as a threat. At the core, what they're trying to protect is an idealized image of themselves, and even a small crack might bring the whole illusion down. Accepting that you don't have all the answers is freeing. It's scary, yes, but it also opens the door to discovery, to connection, to real growth. Because real strength doesn't come from never changing your mind. It comes from being flexible enough to evolve. Certainty that doesn't allow room for questions isn't security. It's control, and like all forms of over-control, it says more about the pain we're trying to hide than about the world outside. Sometimes the anger someone feels about a certain behavior has nothing to do with the other person, and everything to do with their own past. What triggers fury, discomfort, or disgust may actually be a reflection of an unresolved version of themselves. That repulsion becomes an attempt to erase traces of the past, as if, by rejecting in others a trait they once had, they could escape the pain or shame tied to that part of their story. And let's be honest, it's hard to look in the mirror when the reflection still hurts. It's common to see people judge others' vulnerability, mocking it or pulling away as if it were an unforgivable weakness. But behind that harshness, there's often someone who was once judged for being too sensitive, someone who got hurt for trusting too much, someone who had to toughen up to survive. And now, as a defense, they attack what once represented their own pain, like a soldier who despises fear in others, because they're still carrying their own fear. Buried deep, Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And that's not just a beautiful quote. It's an invitation to face discomfort. Because when we honestly observe what deeply affects us in others, we often find wounds that haven't healed. Hatred, in that sense, reveals itself as emotional camouflage, an unconscious strategy to push away what still hurts inside. This also applies to people who are radically critical of certain lifestyles, choices, or ways of expressing themselves. For example, someone who aggressively mocks people who enjoy being admired might be fighting their own buried desire to feel seen, a desire they once learned was silly, wrong, or dangerous. In that case, the criticism becomes a broken mirror. Instead of reflecting clearly, it distorts and throws those inner struggles outward. In the end, when someone hates with intensity, it's worth asking, what are they trying to erase? What part of themselves are they burying under layers of criticism? Hatred can be, paradoxically, one of the most desperate forms of self-defense, and also one of the most revealing. It's often in that distorted reflection that we find the version of ourselves that still needs forgiveness, not from others, but from ourselves. Some people don't argue. They preach. They don't listen. They accuse, and they don't talk. They deliver verdicts. At first glance, it might seem like they live by high principles, guided by a firm, unshakable moral compass. But when rigidity becomes the rule and compassion disappears, that's when the mask begins to crack. Because not all morality is virtue. Often, it's just a shield to hide guilt, fear, or desires the person doesn't want to admit to having. Think of that coworker who's always pointing fingers, outraged by others' behavior, or the person who constantly presents themselves as a model of integrity, but never allows themselves to show weakness. Behind that posture, there might be someone desperately trying to stay away from a part of themselves that still feels shame. The louder the morality, the quieter the inner conflict tends to be. Nietzsche once said that morality is the herd instinct in action, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. He saw that so-called higher morality as a form of collective control, a way of making everyone behave the same, often driven by fear of other people's freedom, and that applies on a societal level as much as it does in our personal lives. Sometimes, moral discourse is less about virtue and more about domination, a way to silence others and, in the process, silence one's own doubts. In many cases, extreme moralism is soaked in anger, and as we've seen, anger is a great disguise for insecurity. That's why the ones preaching the most purity are often the ones most afraid of being found out, because the more someone needs to appear flawless, the less room they have to deal with their own human contradictions. The truth is, no one gets it right all the time. Everyone feels desire, envy, fear. The real difference lies between those who accept that and those who hide it. So, next time someone comes off as morally perfect, take a closer look, not with judgment, but with curiosity, because the constant need to position oneself above others isn't a sign of superiority. It's a sign of effort, a huge effort to avoid facing one's own contradictions. In the end, moral superiority, when performed, says less about virtue, and a lot more about a desperate attempt to keep emotions under control. Some people need everything in its place, every object, every word, every movement precisely planned. It's not just about organization, it's a thirst for control. But what looks like efficiency might actually be a silent cry for help, because usually, the ones trying to control everything around them are running from the chaos within. The outside has to be spotless, so the inside doesn't fall apart. The urge to control is born from a deep fear. The fear of losing love, respect, safety, stability. It's as if life were a dam full of cracks, and the person is there, hands trembling, trying to plug every hole at once. They control their kids' schedules, their partner's words, the tone of conversations, even how others are supposed to grieve. But deep down, that control isn't about others. It's all about their own feeling of helplessness. Nietzsche didn't write directly about control, but he spoke of the will to power, not as domination, but as a way of affirming one's own existence. When that will turns into a suffocating grip, it loses its creative force and becomes a prison. And that prison spills into relationships. Living with someone obsessed with control is like walking on glass. Every step off script feels like a threat, and the connection slowly wears down until there's nothing left but the fear of making a mistake. This need to make sure nothing strays from the plan also shuts out the unexpected, and it's in the unexpected that real life happens. The improv, the stumbles, the pauses. That's where genuine connection is born, but someone who's always trying to predict tomorrow can't fully experience today, and that, in the end, is the biggest loss. Because living without control can be scary, but living trapped by it is living numb. Trying to control everything all the time isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign of exhaustion, because the more you try to hold on, the more things slip through your fingers. And maybe the first step to letting go isn't giving everything up at once, but recognizing that control, at some point, was a survival strategy. The wall doesn't have to come down in one blow, but at the very least, we need to understand why we built it. Some people just can't stop. There's always a new project, a goal reached, a course underway, an invisible trophy being chased. At first glance, it looks admirable, like discipline, ambition, drive, but behind that overperformance, there's often fear of stopping, because when you stop, you feel. And feeling, sometimes, is like opening a door that's been locked for far too long. That constant chase for results often hides unresolved silences. Some people only feel alive when they're producing, because when they're not busy, the emptiness shows up. And emptiness is cruel because it doesn't scream. It just sits there, whispering truths we've been trying to ignore, like the feeling of never being good enough, of always falling short, of not having value without constant output. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." But the trouble starts when the how becomes armor to protect a why that's never been questioned. Many people are driven by a need to prove something, to their parents, to society, to someone who left, and they don't even realize it. And when they finally achieve it all, they still feel small, because the emptiness they tried to silence with achievements is still there, waiting. The irony is, the more they do, the more disconnected they become from themselves. It's like every new achievement takes them further from what truly matters. Sometimes the breakdown comes during a vacation, or on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when there's nothing to do, and the emotional collapse isn't from the rest itself. It's because the rest removes the distraction, and without the productivity mask, the anxiety they've been pushing away finally shows its face. Overcoming the fear of emptiness doesn't mean stopping everything. It means learning to exist even when there's nothing to deliver. It's about accepting that your worth isn't tied to your performance. And maybe real success is simply being able to sit in silence with your own soul, without running from it. Criticism sometimes is just an inverted lens. What we point out in others often reveals what's at war inside us. It's as if every judgment were an unconscious attempt to hide a part of ourselves we haven't yet come to accept, because it's easier to accuse than to confront the mirror. And in this silent game, criticism becomes a disguised confession. When someone criticizes another for being too needy, maybe they're actually hiding their own fear of needing someone. When a person condemns someone else's ambition, could it be that they're still frustrated about their own unfulfilled dreams? Harsh, bitter criticism says much more about the speaker than the one being spoken about. It's anger trying to silence an unmet desire. Nietzsche said, "We are moralists out of envy more often than conviction." It's a tough line, but it hits home. Often, morality is used as a shield to protect us from feelings we don't want to face. Criticizing others gives us a fleeting sense of superiority. It's a quick ladder for those who feel low, but in truth, it's also a shortcut to self-deception. Criticism can be a misdirected cry, like a letter written to oneself, but delivered to someone else. And the more someone criticizes something over and over, the more likely it is that the root of that thing lies within them. That doesn't mean every criticism is projection, but it's worth asking, why does this bother me so much? Sometimes, the answer has nothing to do with the other person. At the end of the day, criticizing is human. But when criticism becomes a habit, it might be time to look inward. Because often, what we condemn in the world is exactly what we long to heal inside ourselves. There are wounds that don't scream. They repeat. And when we don't listen, they speak again. Not with words, but through choices, through patterns, through cycles that repeat themselves as if they had a life of their own. Different people, same endings, new places, same old pain. And then comes the question, why does this always happen to me? Repeating isn't stupidity. Repeating is an attempt. It's the unconscious trying to resolve something left unfinished, creating a new scenario in hopes that, this time, the ending will be different. But if we don't understand what's trying to be resolved, we just repeat, again and again. Unhealed trauma becomes an invisible script we follow without even realizing it. Nietzsche wrote, "We become what we endure." And as uncomfortable as that sounds, it explains a lot. What we don't heal, we end up becoming. Emotional patterns are like leaks in a quiet house. They seem small, but over time, they reshape everything. If you always end up choosing emotionally unavailable people, maybe it's not bad luck. Maybe it's your unconscious trying to recover, in absence what was once missing. These patterns are silent confessions. They show where it hurt, where it lacked, where it still feels open, and as painful as that may be, they're also invitations. Because once we recognize a pattern, we can break it. We can choose differently. We can, for the first time, act out of choice, not from the wound. Understanding the repetition is giving a name to the inner silence. It's stopping the cycle of walking in circles with our eyes closed. because pain only stops leading the way when we start to understand it, and that's when the cycle can finally be broken. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one most afraid of breaking inside, the one who never shows weakness, never admits mistakes, never says, "I don't know." And the more they need to prove their strength, the more it feels like something is being hidden. It's not always arrogance. Often, it's just defense. There's a huge difference between being strong and looking strong. Real strength comes from well-processed vulnerability. The other comes from fear. Fear of facing one's own shame. It's like building a castle on top of the thing you fear most, and to avoid looking down, you pile on achievements, you win, you lead, you push through. But all of it fueled by a desperate energy to run from yourself, apologize, never show exhaustion. Absolutely not. Admit guilt for past choices. Out of the question. The problem is, the more this strength is performed, the harder it is to let go of, because it starts to define who the person is. Or rather, who they believe they need to be to keep avoiding pain. Nietzsche said, "Guilt is the whip we use on ourselves." And this performative strength is often just an attempt to quiet that whip. But it doesn't work. Unresolved guilt always finds a way to show itself, through explosive reactions, emotional rigidity, or relationships where no one is allowed to get truly close. Real strength doesn't need to shout. It's calm, steady, quiet. But when it's just armor, it gets heavy. And the heavier it gets, the harder it is to see that what you're carrying might not be courage, but guilt. Envy is quiet. It's rarely confessed, but it lives there, tucked behind sarcasm, criticism, and disdain. How many times have we seen someone mock an artist, a writer, someone who lives freely and creatively, when what really bothers them is that freedom they never allowed themselves? Nietzsche wrote, "Envy is sick admiration." It's admiration that, because it can't be admitted, turns into attack, sarcasm, or devaluation. The issue isn't with the other person. It's with the dream we never had the courage to face, the dream to be, to do, to live in a way we once imagined, and later buried. This repression builds discomfort, and since desire can't be killed, the brain tries to discredit it. That's why envious people don't say, "I wish I had that too." They say, "That's easy. That's not even that good. Anyone could do that." But deep down, that minimizing is just an attempt to cope with the pain of not having what they want, or worse, of never even giving themselves a chance to try. Envy is a shy confession, and the more someone feels the need to criticize, mock, or belittle something another person does, the more it's worth asking, is this anger really just repressed longing? A longing for something I never had the courage to choose? Envy isn't about the other person. It's about what we wish we could be, but haven't yet dared to allow ourselves to become. Some people take pride in saying, "I don't need anyone." They say it firmly, like it's a badge of honor, as if not needing anyone equals strength. But behind that statement, there's often a pain that hasn't been named. Because when someone keeps repeating they don't need others, maybe they're really just trying to convince themselves. Hyper-independence is, in many cases, the scar of abandonment. It's what's left after someone learned, too early, that relying on others can hurt. It's a defense built from disappointment. After all, if no one can hurt you, then you don't have to fear being left behind. But that armor comes at a high cost. The person closes off so much, tries so hard to prove their independence, that they start to push away even those who want to stay. The fear of depending turns into fear of connecting. And so, to avoid abandonment, they abandon first. Attachment theory has already explained this. Broken or insecure bonds can lead to distancing patterns. The problem is, the more someone shuts themselves off, the less room they leave for real affection to grow. Deep relationships require vulnerability, and that's scary for someone who's come to associate intimacy with pain. Deep down, no one is born wanting to be entirely self-sufficient. We learn it. We learn that asking for help is weakness, that needing someone is dangerous. But we can also unlearn that. We can learn that opening up isn't a flaw. It's a sign of emotional courage. Not all anger is just anger. Sometimes it's sadness that couldn't find the right words. It's grief without a ritual. It's old pain, stored up, that didn't know how else to come out. And so it bursts in the form of shouting, impatience, sarcasm, as if dressing pain in the armor of aggression makes it easier to bear than facing the emptiness inside. Some people seem irritated by everything, always on edge, reacting way too strongly to small things. But if we look a little deeper, we might find that this behavior comes from a place far more fragile than fierce. Because the truth is, anger protects. It protects against abandonment, rejection, helplessness. It's a shield against the feeling of being left behind, by someone, by a dream, by an unmet expectation. Nietzsche said that pain needs a disguise, and aggression is one of the most common. It's loud, it demands respect, it pushes people away. But underneath all that noise, there's often a silent plea for help. Behind the yelling, there's a heart that just wants to be seen, and that learned the hard way that vulnerability was too dangerous. You see this a lot in people who lost important bonds early in life, who never had space to grieve, who were never taught that crying is part of the healing process. Anger becomes their way of staying intact, because letting go might feel like opening the door to collapse, so they harden. But healing doesn't come from suppressing the anger. It comes from listening to it, from understanding what it's hiding, what it's guarding. When someone is met with empathy in their pain, the anger starts to lose its grip, because finally, that wounded part doesn't have to scream just to be heard. Truly seeing someone goes beyond reading gestures or interpreting words. It's about feeling what's behind what's being said, realizing that a silence can hold more pain than a full-blown confession, and that what someone hides behind smiles or sarcasm is often the very thing they most wish someone would notice. Even if they can't say it out loud, compassion isn't pity, it's deep sensitivity. It's the lens that reveals what the other person can't express. We grow up thinking that understanding someone means knowing what to say, giving good advice, having the right answers. But over time, we learn that silent presence, non-judgmental listening, a gaze that doesn't turn away, those are the things that truly touch the soul. Those are the things that heal, that set people free. Because when someone feels genuinely seen, without having to explain themselves, without having to perform, something inside them begins to reorganize. Nietzsche warned us of the danger of fighting monsters and becoming one. And that's exactly why compassion is so revolutionary. It keeps us from reacting to others' pain with coldness, violence, or control. It reminds us that behind every defense, there's a story. Behind every wall, there's fear. And behind every difficult behavior, there's a human being trying not to fall apart. Compassion isn't naive. It's emotional wisdom. It's seeing what others miss and still choosing to stay. Not to fix the other person, but to show them they can exist without masks, without needing to fight, without needing to be on guard all the time. It's a kind of presence that disarms without force, that transforms without intruding. And maybe that's what we need most right now. People who look with kindness, who understand that everyone is carrying invisible battles, who know that sometimes the best way to heal someone is simply not to hurt them any further.